And now, from the palatial Panorama Studios in Southern California, this is Jonathan Albin and Creative Differences. Alrighty, welcome everybody. This is NycosRPG. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about two topics. In particular, we are going to take on the... boy, my brain dropped right out of my head there. Let's try that again. Welcome to Creative Differences. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, and today we are going to be delving into the two topics that I find to be an interesting juxtaposition between the player and the game master. And these videos are intended to help you build your local games group, your community, and in fact, the world that you role play in. I have 50 years of experience as a game master, running virtually every property ever written, with a few possible exceptions. But the focus really is on dynamic role play in a variety of genre settings. So today we're going to be looking at two topics. But before we do that, I do want to remind you that this program is a property of NycosRPG, and we are working with the development of the next iteration of roleplay games in NycosRPG. And if you want to know more information about the setting and the world of Nykos, check out our weekly news reports. They are usually titled something along the lines of Nykos Nightly News, but I've varied them up over time, so I'm now rambling. But if you haven't yet, make sure you like and subscribe to this channel. If you are a Twitch member, consider subscribing to the channel, because that way you get a commercial-free experience. If you are viewing this on YouTube, like, subscribe, hit all the buttons down below, because it really helps to keep this a daily channel. Alrighty, we are going to be talking about two particular topics. I'm going to kind of flash review them, and then we will come back to them in particular. But we are going to be talking about the concept of the preferences one has when you play a role-play game, and how those changes in preference can change the way you play the game. And then we're also going to be talking about handling random number generation, dice rolling, and why and how we roll the dice and why that matters. Alrighty, so in dealing with role-playing preferences, the first of our two topics for today, when a person sits down to play a role-play game, we've talked several times about the reality that a player simply brings to the table what they want out of the game, and generally they're going to endeavor to get what they're wanting out of the game, regardless of what the storyteller, game master, or the other players even want, and in many cases, the desire to get what you came for, it becomes overpowering and it affects the way you play. So we're going to talk about some of the ones in particular, and how we can mediate and mitigate the differences so that we can stay at the same table and not lose friendships over it, which unfortunately has been the case over the 5 decades I've been playing role-play games. First thing we're going to talk about is our motivation for play. When people sit down, we've talked about perhaps they are coming to the game with I only live once, so I want to do something exciting. Perhaps they're coming to the table with I don't know what the physics are, so I really don't know what I can or can't get away with. Perhaps they're coming with a rather sordid and dark intention for their play. Again, these are regardless of what other people came to the table for, and this is absent the session 0 that we've talked about. But these motivations, these reasons to play, sometimes are overriding. And so it's really important to get a handle on what the person came to do with the game that they are playing. sometimes when we are dedicated to generating a story, we go to the point of fundamentally railroading our players. We want so much for a certain scene to enact that we force it or whatever. And even that itself can be a problematic motivation for playing. And so you have to kind of moderate and mediate what you want from the game as much as you ask the players to do the same. And these variances can be challenging. So it's a matter of opening your mind when it comes to determining what the collective will do. A second way the players will be different from each other, I guess. I'm trying to figure out a clever way of saying that, but is the very play style and orientation they have in gameplay. And by that, I mean, are they quick and impulsive and simply knee-jerk react to every scene? Or do they have a means to their madness? By developing an understanding of how their play style affects the persona that they are actually playing, you can at least make the intentional changes to keep the game centered in a way that it keeps all the players involved. It's sometimes difficult when one person's play style is knee-jerk respond, must act now, and another person's much more reserved and considerate and deliberate in their actions, and sometimes you have to figure out how to draw those lines. I know I'm building up to this concept of the Session Zero, and we're going to possibly start the Session Zero Chronicles again here in a few weeks. I haven't gotten to that point yet, but the idea is we need to get the players to a place where their challenges and their difficulties are manageable and recognizable. So it's a matter of literally determining what a person's play style is like and orienting the adventure around those play style differences so they become coherent and can actually work together. This next one is the very predicate for the second subject today, but die rolling peccadillos is, for me, one of the touchiest points in dealing with players, and that is some players have this great desire to have dice that are so arcane that across the room or across the table you cannot read what their dice say. They're very ornate, very beautiful most times. I've got a friend of mine who has basically diamond encrusted dice so that they scintillate and reflect all the light in the room. So when they roll them, it actually, creates a brilliant light show on the ceiling of the area we're playing. But the dice are so ornate you can't make out their faces. Some players really like dice that are big and heavy and clunky and might actually cause physical harm if they roll into your arm. So that can be problematic. Nowadays, there are a lot of people who really like the precision of the milled steel dice or other types of metal, and there can be some heft on those, and perhaps a person's die rolling is not very controlled, and therefore they're tossing them across the room, possibly hitting somebody in the eye and causing a race to the emergency room. I'm kidding, of course, but the problems with die rolling themselves, the very way people roll their dice, can be problematic. I have a friend of mine who loves to hold the dice so you can hear them clacking together in his hand, but then when he lays them on the table, he literally puts his hand down, just puts his hand on the surface with the dice under them, and then he lifts his hand. Well, gosh, if you're rattling the dice, I don't suppose you're talented enough to feel the indentation of when that 20 hits the top of your hand, but boy, that roll mechanism sure seems to net a lot of plus 10 on the dice roll. So all these different challenges that we can have with the way people roll dice itself can be moderated and mitigated by having a discussion about the very processes and how the die rolling is accomplished. Further, there are those people who roll the dice and grab them up quickly and call out the die roll number, even though no one else got to see them. So, one of the ways that in particular that peccadillo can be handled is to make for a general rolling area on the table, and that leads directly into, of course, play area organization. Many people they're dispersed and they spread their materials all over a large area because they want to be comfortable. They know where everything is, and so they're at touch with all of their belongings. But this can be problematic, especially if you have a relatively small play area. So having an understanding of organization does fix that. But it also is a matter of having that conversation with other players to find out what their needs are so that no player is causing discomfort for any of the others. Of course, the very place that you play can be a preference, and you may choose whether you want to be playing in a very noisy coffee shop, perhaps in the back of a less busy restaurant. Maybe you've got a office space that you can play at, or even your living room or your den. The idea of what the play location provides in terms of ambiance also weighs heavy on the ability and the intensity of the players to get really involved in the game. So be aware of, if not actually actively adjust the play place, because that will make a difference. For those of you that are retail game store owners, I highly recommend that you build up a play space area in such a way that there's ample seating, ample room for people's belongings, ample room for die rolling and all of that, so that you create a comfort space for your community, because that is ultimately what's going to be the saving grace in the advancing years as the internet and online sales continue to ramp up. Eventually, it'll be very competitive to even justify having physical area, and so by having a dedicated and loyal play base at your location is going to be a long-term advantage to you. So do consider the ambiance and the surroundings of your play areas. Another element of role-playing preferences that really needs to be considered is how much the players are invested in their character and in their game, and how well you are attuned to it. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we had a player who, in the process of the game, shared some of his equipment, and then the other player treated the equipment with disrespect and actually got it destroyed. Well, that player had been invested in his belongings, and he took it very hard. Now, in a player to player or player to game master conversation, perhaps I should have been able to get a better handle on the realization of the investment one puts in their gear or belongings. But the upshot of that was that by learning how the players invest and how the players engage with their character, their persona, their belongings, maybe their location or even their steed, really does help to make the game play feel more accepting of everyone. So this concept of emotional investment is not only on the basis of how well they are engaging with the story, but how much the material belongings and the things that they are experiencing become real to them as players and as the persona in particular. The next one is an interesting one, and that is to deal with the separation anxiety. I have several players who dearly love the story of Nikos and literally can't get enough, and so they watch all of my videos. They go to the game store where I run games, and they play online. And the biggest challenge with this is that sometimes you have to really work on the endings of your sessions so that your players do not create for themselves this vacuum of doubt that develops into separation anxiety. I've actually had calls hours after a game session from players who were almost practically hyperventilating because they left some detail unsaid in the game session, and they're concerned with the ramification, believing that I'm pursuing all of the diligent details of the campaign and will punish them somehow for not accomplishing whatever the task was. And so the idea here is that when you're building your, I just realized I misspelled separation. I'm going to fix that for later videos. Separation anxiety. Once I realized that there was a challenge there, I was able to dial back on the concerns and make the players feel more at home by taking away that very visible, very visceral separation anxiety. And the last one of these is actually personal boundaries. And it sounds crazy that you'd have to say this, but I've had games groups where hours after a game session was over, I'm at a restaurant eating dinner or whatever, and my player shows up there exasperated because they want to know more. They want to get more details. And while this did develop into the idea of doing game session debriefs, which I've come to really love and I recommend them to everybody, but establishing a line between the game and real life sometimes is very important for those who arguably maybe have an active imagination and want to stay in that realm all the time. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing so, but it's a matter of developing your framework for dealing with players. And this difference of opinion on what those boundaries are need to be handled in a public way, in a communal way, so that there's no bad feelings or isolation or poking at a particular person on this. But these role-playing preferences are definitely ways that the groups and the individuals differ, and to make your game sessions really explode and expand, you want to figure out how to resolve these. And the real answer to all of these does come down to session 0. So I've now pushed myself to the point that will be what I do tonight. We will do our session 0 video tonight at 11 p.m. So stick around for that. Now let's go ahead and talk about our other subject. But before that, I want to take a couple minutes to talk about what it is I'm doing here. Many of you know that I've been a game master for 50 years and that I have a great affinity and appreciation for fantasy roleplay in specific and roleplay of all kinds in general. But perhaps you don't know the story of the world of Nykos. I have been running campaigns for all of 51 years almost now, and in all of that time I have run the same storyline roughly 7 years before it recycles, and so every 7 years we start again. Well, in this world that we live in, it's important to get property out that helps others to see what you're doing, and so patreon.com is the mechanism by which I am supporting the concept of NycosRPG as a play tool. It's fundamentally a role-play toolbox that can be used across all genres, and in particular, we are getting ready to, it's in final edit of the pre-release version, the master book, which is the central document that would be used to run all of the different adventure types and themes. And if you want to know more about that and to become part of our community, check out patreon.com/Nykos. And if you become a member there, you're able to join our play community, and you are then invited to play one of our active game sessions. Currently there are 2, one on Saturdays and one on Sundays, and you can become a part of that simply by becoming a part of our program at NycosRPG. At patreon.com/Nykos. Wow. Not even looking at the page. Great, John. All right, so we've talked about roleplay preferences. Now we're going to take from that third point about die rolling peccadillos, and we're going to talk about handling random number generators, random number generation, and variance in your game sessions, and in essence to talk about how we roll dice and how that matters to the games that we play. One of the biggest challenges is that in the narrow band of what is role-playing games, there are a certain number of people who simply have an absolute desire and need to always win. They can't even abide the thought of not being the winner in a game or not succeeding. And so the very concept of using random number generation, that is die rolling in a game, can literally cause them apoplexy. I have several friends who are absolutely convinced that they can out role play, ROLE play, any role play, ROLL play that you would put forward. And one of the biggest challenges to running a role play game is how do you resolve those situations that absolutely require dice rolls, and what happens if you don't need them and you depend on them, and B, you do need them but you can't use them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but right now the realization is that the need to win most often has to do with the player's self-confidence. They are not trusting in themselves to believe that they are able to accomplish what needs to be done in game, and therefore they depend on really good die rolls. I have an individual who played with me for many years who I didn't actually mechanically track it, but I often joked about doing so. But I would assess that given that the average die roll requirement in a role-playing game is somewhere between 12 and 20, I don't believe that person ever. I did not that I don't believe, but the joke was always that they never rolled below a 15. That out of 3.5 years of role play, they never had a value of less than a 15 or 16 on the dice roll. It literally seemed like they had were always succeeding, and this need to win becomes really a factor of something that occurs in role-playing games quite naturally, and that is that the game master unintentionally is awarding glory and honor to really good dice rolls, even in the face of really good role play. And this idea of false glory really is a challenge, because the game players want so bad to be affirmed in what they're doing and what the decisions they've made and such, that they're willing to compromise their own virtue in terms of hiding bad dice rolls. I have another player in my recent games who actively wears a t-shirt that says that bad dice rolls make great stories. And that's the flip side, if you will, of this concept of the need to win. The false glory angle certainly makes the player feel better, but that sophomoric expression or feeling of good or rightness because of a good die roll is itself a falsehood when they have to consider how many times they had to fake or falsify what they actually rolled in order to get it. And so it becomes truly a false glory, because they're not getting any of the really well-deserved praise that they might have gotten had they only done their role playing it without the extra L, so to speak, the ROLE style play instead of ROLL. But this leads then, therefore, to the question of when do you roll dice? In a good role-playing situation where the players are interacting and their conversation with the NPCs and such in a game session, there's really no need ever to go to dice rolls if you are trying to resolve conflicts without combat. So really deciding when to roll dice really is a matter of how much of the variability, the RNG, do you want to be inserted in your game session. This element of randomness that we seem to feel is necessary in a game for it to feel like a game is an endemic that actually causes the game sessions themselves to sometimes either go off the rails or run aground or whatever. In one session alone, one of the only 3 TPKs I ever had really came down to horrible, awful, no good, bad die rolls. And if you've pulled RNG into the game session, you have fundamentally given permission for everything to go off the rails. So we're going to come back to this in a second, but I should state the very obvious first rule of role-play games. And when I get ready to say it, you can almost say it with me. I'm pretty certain, and I'm pretty certain that you're going to be wrong. Most people think that the first rule of role-play games is that the game master is always right. And while that is a useful rule, it's not the first one. It's not the most essential even, but it is definitely up there. The first rule of role-play games is that no dice roll is ever required. If the game master is on a roll and he's telling and relating the tale, and the players are interacting and putting in their input and they're being received, there is absolutely no need to put an RNG, a random number generator response, in that conversation whatsoever. So the knowing that, therefore, then the RNG, whether or not it matters, really comes down to when they are part of the game. Now, before I go any further, I do want to go back for a second and talk a little bit about the idea of communal rolls. Many of you that have been at my tables know that all dice rolls are made in the open. Everybody gets to see everybody's die rolls. This promotes social trust, and it also is kind of a external generator of quality assurance so that there's no issues of integrity between players. But the reason to pitch communal die rolling beyond the obvious is that it does allow for players to feel confident that what they give you as the answer onto what their dice roll is becomes, self-affirming. They know you see the dice roll, but they can flat out tell you, I've succeeded or failed or whatever. And this adds to the collective consciousness and the awareness that the die roll really is something that's separate from the players, and therefore they can't either take pride or feel guilt about a good or poor roll. So the question then is asked, what really makes an RNG matter? When do we have to have a die roll determine things? And the true answer is whenever you feel like. But just realize that the addition of RNG, random number generation, into your scenes is giving place for chaos to reign. And so it's a matter of limiting and adjudicating those die rolls to the point where you can fundamentally deal with them differently. As I mentioned, a friend of mine has a shirt that says that bad rolls are good role play. This does lead to the question, do the die rolls affirm in a crazy, silly, comedic way, or do the die rolls conform to a much more sad and dour and tragic way? And the reality is that this is the matter of the game players themselves and how they choose to interact. A bad die roll often can be a juxtaposition because it's a matter of how the game master determines their outcomes. And in my way of thinking and in the mechanics of NycosRPG, a individual bad roll is only a symptom of something that's going on. but it does mean that if you are going to depend on the die rolls, you can end up with rather tragic or comedic scenes where things go horribly, awfully wrong in the game session. Which leads to finally the idea of the effective retcon. If you have had a series of poorly interpreted die rolls, or the things have gone bad and they simply can't seem to succeed on the die rolls, it is perfectly fine to effectively retcon the situation with everyone being a part of the conversation and redefining what actually happened, because it may be that it was simply a bad day for everyone, both the good guys and the bad guys, and therefore it can be just hand waved and mitigated, or it can be this was a bad example of how we didn't need to roll dice anyway, and therefore completely change the conditions and reestablish the story outside of the actual die rolls. That's not my go-to, but there have been times when the effective retcon has been absolutely essential to save games. So when we talk about die rolls all the way across here, we're talking about when they're needed and how we roll them, and rolling in the open, rolling when others can see, rolling when the game master requires it and not just simply when you want to roll dice. All these things lend themselves to a more coherent role-play experience, and thereby helping you to work through the creative differences you might have with your players and your on the other side, the game master. Alrighty, we have completed the materials that I wanted to get through. We're right at a half an hour, so excellent. This has been Jonathan Albin and NycosRPG, and the show has been Creative Differences. Realize that we are on the air Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time. And we are also at Board Games Paradise in Redlands, California on Mondays and Tuesdays at 6 p.m. until 10 p.m., also Pacific. And, of course, if you get involved with our Patreon program, which we mentioned earlier, patreon.com/Nykos, you can become a part of our community and play games with us on Saturday and Sunday, 9 o'clock a.m. on Saturday, 1 p.m. Pacific time on Sunday. And I hope to see you all at a game session soon. I'm Jonathan Albin, and I approve this message.